So a little while back I did a video about King Arthur and the historicity of Arthur and whether I think Arthur is real or who Arthur is according to the earliest sources we have, and it got some really interesting and very well-meaning comments that I found confusing. So some of these comments, which I hope will appear on the screen, are suggesting that one of the origin stories for the sword in the stone myth is the idea that it was meant to be bronze casting. One of the comments, which again was very well-meaning, suggested that at the time of King Arthur, the majority of the swords being made in Britain would have been cast. That's not the case. From all of the evidence that we have, from the earliest sources, as explained in that video, you can watch if you want, Arthur was a dux bellorum, a war leader of the Britons after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, so after the removal of the Roman legions from Britain, and during the time when the Angles, Jutes, and Saxons are invading. So he is very much portrayed as a migration-era war leader. The migration era being after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, largely. Boxing stuff in is never useful, means that the vast majority, in fact, all of the weapons being used at the time were made from blacksmith-forged iron. They are iron weapons. We are still in the Iron Age at this point. And I started thinking, where does this idea come from? Because this isn't just something that one person believes. Like 3, 4, 5, 6 people maybe have all suggested this on my video in the comments. So I thought, this is coming from somewhere. Somebody has started spreading this frankly ridiculous concept. And I might have discovered who it was. So, first off, I have to thank the BS Historian, because I went on their website, and I don't know who you are, IRL, but your website is great, fun, and they identified 2 places where I think this has come into the public consciousness. The first is a Time Team special where an eminent British archaeologist called Francis Pryor, this guy, the beardy man of Time Teams, presents the idea that the sword in the stone myth may go back further to the Bronze Age when, yes, swords were cast, and using a stone mould to cast a bronze sword is something that was done. He also then presents it on his series, his TV series called Britain AD, and it's quite a popular series, quite a lot of people have seen it, and again, this idea comes out that this relates to bronze swords being cast in Britain, and he says it in a way that makes it sound very believable, and this is a man who went to Trinity College, Cambridge to study archaeology. He's been on Time Team, he's worked all over the world, and he's talking bollocks, and here's why. So let's start, first of all, with the sword in the stone part of this story. Some of you guys will know that Arthur appears in stories written by the old Welsh poets, the Cynfeirdd and the Gorgynfeirdd, you know, around sort of the sub-Roman era. So we're talking 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. Cool, great stuff. Arthur then becomes a trope, he becomes a literary figure, he becomes a feature of poems and stories and that kind of thing for hundreds and hundreds of years in Welsh, in the Welsh tradition. So he's being written about in Middle Welsh, he's being, his story is being expanded in Middle Welsh. Then, a very long time after that, in the 12th century and 13th century, a man called Robert du Boron appears. And Robert is a poet, he's a writer, and he's working in French. And this is where we start getting the mort d'Arthur, the death of Arthur. I'm a little bit adenoidal with a cold, so désolé to all of mes amis francophones. This is making it difficult. And that's where we get the sword in the stone. So the sword in the stone myth does not appear before Robert takes over and starts messing with stuff. The sword in the stone myth is French. It's a French addition to the myth of King Arthur. And it appears towards the end of the 12th century, 1190s, let's say the 1190s, and it's not in a stone anyway, it's in an anvil, which is on top of a stone. So the sword is in an anvil, the anvil is then on a stone. So in the original text, already pretty clear that it's more of a reference, if anything, to blacksmith forged iron than it is to bronze, especially cast bronze. So that pretty much blows this theory out of the water straight away. But further to that is something that the BS historian picks up on, which is the sheer timescales involved here. So let's assume the original King Arthur was not a Dux Bellorum, was not a sub-Roman war leader, did not defend against incursions of Angles, Saxons and Jutes, and was not called upon to defend Great Britain following the withdrawal of the Roman legions. Let's assume none of that happened, and let's assume that none of that was written about in Middle Welsh for 500 years before Robert de Boron got hold of King Arthur. Let's assume that none of that happened. Instead, we would have to assume, for this to be true, that in King Arthur's time, the majority of swords were cast in bronze. That would put us at the end of the Bronze Age, start of the Iron Age. Where does that put us? Well, instead of that putting us at around the late 400s, early 500s AD, that puts us around 500 BC. So that would be 1,000 years earlier. That is a long-ass time, my friends. That is a very long time. We've already had to throw out the entire King Arthur mythos to make this theory work. Do we have any evidence of that being the case? Well, no, actually, absolutely zilcho. No evidence whatsoever. There's too much that this would need to work that is missing. We've got no evidence that the Gogynfeirdd were all gathered around a bronze sword and said, it must be the sword of King Arthur. Who's King Arthur? Well, King Arthur was this fabulous Bronze Age hero. Furthermore, we don't really have any evidence that they had a stone mould, that they knew that the stone mould was for casting bronze, that they had any sort of inkling that 1,000 years before they were alive, there was a thing called the Bronze Age, when all swords were made of bronze. We don't know that. The idea of the Bronze Age is relatively recent, so there's no evidence to suggest that they had the kind of prior knowledge of the ages of metallurgy that would give them enough information to say, well, it's clear that 1,000 years ago the majority of swords were made of cast bronze, and therefore a mighty war leader would have had a cast bronze sword. Thus, Arthur, the king, would have been equipped with a sword of bronze, which would have been cast in a stone mould, and so I will allegorically and metaphorically be using the image of a sword in a stone to suggest that Arthur is actually a Bronze Age figure. Yeah, but the sword is in an anvil, Francis. The sword is in an anvil. It's in an anvil in a stone. It does not work. So, we've got to get through the fact that the Bronze Age ended 1,000 years before the story of King Arthur is first written down. The poets have no real knowledge of the Bronze Age as far as we are concerned, like we have no idea. King Arthur is absolutely described as a post-Roman war leader who is fighting against the Saxons, and the sword in the stone, the sword in the anvil part doesn't appear until 500 years after the first mentions of King Arthur. It doesn't work, and it will never work. It's frankly nonsense, and it's kind of irresponsible for somebody like Francis Pryor to be spreading that kind of, honestly, garbage. I would be ashamed of myself if I had been spreading this kind of nonsensical theory, because I am an archaeologist. I'm not an art historian. I'm not a literary historian. If I had a 10-minute conversation with a literary historian who knows about the King Arthur myth, they would say, no, Jimmy, mate, this idea is crap. None of the chronologies fit together, and also, it's not in a stone, it's in an anvil. There is an interesting idea that maybe Robert got the idea for the sword in the stone from some miracles or myths happening at the time, and there's one in particular that nobody mentions that is on the BS Historians blog, which is, and I was really pleased to see it, Saint Galgano. Saint Galgano is from basically a town which was near Siena in Tuscany in Italy, and at Saint Galgano's tomb there is what appears to be a late 12th century sword embedded in a rock. So this is contemporary with Robert du Boron. He may very well have heard of this myth, gone and seen the sword, which is stuck in a stone. It's there. You can go and see it now if you've got the money. Go and have a look at it. St. Galgano's tomb. Send me a picture if you're ever there. Maybe that's where the myth comes from. So rather than trying to shoehorn the concept of bronze casting in a stone mould, when an awful lot of them would have been made of sand or clay anyway, maybe we use the evidence we have, Francis? Maybe we do that, because an awful lot of the time, it is the simplest answer. Like, we don't need it. So, the sword in the stone. Is it a Bronze Age sword? Absolutely effing not. No way. There's no way. Is it possibly a reference to the sword in the stone of Saint Galgano of Tuscany? Absolutely, possibly. In fact, I think it's likely that that's where it comes from, and he added it into his fun, expanded mythos of King Arthur for his fancy new epic poems and his various stories that he was trying to sell to noble people. So, there you go. The sword in the stone myth isn't a Bronze Age sword. It's really not. Diolch yn fawr iawn am ymuno. Unwaith eto, thank you very much indeed for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you would like to support the channel, then feel free to join the Patreon or sling me a coffee on the coffee page. We've got nearly 300 patrons now. It's insane. And we've got some fun extra bonus content coming this year for the Patreon feed. So, patrons, thank you for your patience, thank you for your support. Bonus stuff is inbound, both video and audio. So, till the next time, tan y tro nesa, hwyl fawr am y tro. Bye for now. Recipe. That is a terrible cup of tea. That is a truly awful cup of tea. Ugh. I blame the English.